Good afternoon and welcome to DCR's question and answer virtual lunch hour with Jason Killeen. My name is Jason Cleo. I'm an assistant executive director with the Department of Cannabis Regulation. Just a general public announcement for folks joining today's webinar. We have started the 2024 renewal process. That process opened on Saturday, September 2nd. So folks are currently starting to submit renewal records. Just so that members of the public understand, DCR is reviewing the records that have been submitted to make sure that the fees are being properly assessed, and then we're making adjustments on the back end to make sure that invoices will be generated with the applicable fees based on the different record types. So if you've already submitted your renewal record and haven't yet seen an invoice, you're not missing anything. We anticipate that those will be generated by the end of next week. And then fees assessed will be adjusted for records that have already been submitted prior to the generation of invoices. And with that, I'm ready to hop into the questions.
Good afternoon, Jason. Our first question comes from Samuel N. What is the total number of all licensing, including PCN, that a social equity applicant can obtain, and how much percentage should an SEIA own for each license?
So there are certain activities that are capped per person. So a person can be an owner of up to 3 retail licenses with on-site sales and the equivalent of 3 medium indoor cultivation licenses. Because the definition relies on owner, if somebody has equity of 20% or more, they're considered an owner. Folks do have equity below 20%, so that doesn't count against the 3 either cultivation licenses or 3 retail storefront licenses that they can have equity in. For non-storefront delivery, manufacturing, distribution, testing, those activities do not have caps tied to specific licenses per owner. So you could be an owner of an unlimited number of those license types. In terms of the social equity individual applicant equity required for each license, it's going to depend on the phase that the license was submitted under and what the individuals, if it was under the 2019 criteria, whether or not the individual was verified as a tier 1 applicant, which means that they'd have to have 51% or more, a tier 2 applicant, which is 33 1/3% or more, or the tier 1, tier 2 applicant who had to have over 33 1/3%. With the new rule that went into place in June, once the record has been identified as a social equity record and the percentage to meet the requirements under LAMC section 10420 have been identified, multiple individual SEIAs have the ability to aggregate their equity share towards meeting that minimum percentage. So generally, records either have to have more than 33 1/3% owned by a verified social equity individual applicant or applicants, or 51% or more. And then really just depending on the individual makeup of the ownership group will kind of depend on what you as an individual SEIA would have to have so that the record can meet the minimum requirements to comply with 10420.
Thank you, Jason. Our second question comes from Jennifer T. Is the social equity carve-out for specific licenses ending in January 2025? And how will storefront applications work after 2025 for general applicants?
So the Los Angeles Municipal Code is sunsetting the carve-out for social equity applicants to apply for the non-storefront delivery and retail storefront applications. If there is retail storefront capacity in January 2025 or later, the municipal code anticipates that a lottery would be conducted to allow for folks to apply for the opportunity to submit those application types.
Our next question comes from Ariella J. As part of the 2024 renewal process, how can an applicant or licensee update the contact information and ownership on an LBER?
So they're currently, the applicant or licensee could go into their ELBR record and initiate an ownership modification. Alternatively, sometime next month, DCR is going to be sending out an email communication to everyone in our annual license application process, letting them know what they need to do to get to a notice of complete application, which includes updating their ELBR records to make sure that it has the most current information on owners, indirect owners, financial interest holders, primary personnel, and then to provide an updated Form 4008, which will basically be a consolidation of the different ownership forms and updated language on the new definitions that went into effect in June. So if it's a pressing matter right now, you can go ahead and submit the modification request against the ELBR, or you can choose to wait until October when we update the ELBR records to allow for everyone to make some annual updates to those records as well as provide us these updated forms. The update to the ELBR will not impact the applicant or licensee's ability to renew their ANN record. So the 4 documents that we need to renew the ANN record are separate and apart from any updates that would occur on the legal business entity record.
Our next question is a follow-up from Ariella. As part of the 2024 renewal process, DCR is requiring the 4005 indemnification form. Does the newest version of the form have to be submitted, or can a previous version of the form be reused?
Please submit the current version of the form.
Joshua E. is asking, how can an SEIA get out of a predatory relationship?
So DCR doesn't get involved in private business disputes, nor are we in a position to provide legal or business advice. If you believe that you're in a predatory business relationship that would violate the requirements of the Los Angeles Municipal Code, I would recommend that you seek qualified legal advice. DCR has partnered with the Los Angeles County Bar Association, and they are providing low bono and pro bono legal services to verified social equity individual applicants. If you haven't already done so, you may want to reach out to the social equity program team to see whether or not you can be referred to that partnership program.
And then this next question is also from Joshua, and it's similar. What should an SEA do if they suspect that their equity share doesn't meet requirements after the business is in operation?
I mean, it's a two-pronged approach. So if you believe that the business may not be in compliance with the municipal code, you may want to seek qualified legal advice before reaching out to the department. As part of the renewal process, there's a series of information and forms that folks submit to attest that they are in compliance with the requirements of the municipal code, whether it's a general record or a social equity record. And, you know, DCR does have the ability to deny an application where there have been material omissions, material misstatements of fact. So to the extent that the entity is providing false information to the city, it could result in the denial of the application, which means that nobody listed on the application would be associated with the application or license record anymore.
Thank you, Jason. Hugo M is asking, do social equity applicants have to apply for the annual license?
Yes. DCR sunset the acceptance of temporary approval applications on July 31st, and all temporary approval application records have been transitioned into the annual license application process. In order to qualify and meet the state's annual licensing requirements, you will have to receive a local annual license so that your environmental report can be adopted, which the state, of course, requires for their annual licensing process. So everybody does have to get an annual license, and we are no longer accepting temporary approval applications.
Thank you, Jason. Our next question comes from Evan F, sorry. Will coaches be coming back?
So the social equity program team is currently working on the request for bids or notices to proceed for the next iteration of the one-on-one coaching program. And they'll announce details as soon as those selections have been made and the program's been extended.
Our next question also comes from Evan. Will there be an extension on the December renewal deadline?
At this time, the renewal is set by code. So the renewal cycle is what it is. Late renewals are accepted through the end of February of 2024, subject to the payment, of course, of additional fees associated with the late submission. If the question was associated with the phase 3 retail round 2 lottery process, the pre-application records for the lottery have to be submitted by December in order to meet the deadline set by the municipal code.
And then our next question comes from Lorenz L. Why is there not more rental assistance?
Rental assistance is based on the availability of grant funds, and currently none of our grant funds are eligible for providing direct financial assistance or rental assistance to applicants. So the monies that were allocated from the state for that purpose have all been exhausted. The social equity team continues to look for additional grant opportunities. And if those grant opportunities do provide for future financial assistance or rental assistance, information would be provided at that time for how folks could apply for it.
This question from Avelina N. The annual record is not allowing me to upload the 4013 and the DCC license copy. What can I do?
So in order to upload documents directly to your annual license application record, it has to be set to a limited number of record statuses. So I would recommend reaching out directly to your assigned analyst to coordinate with them how you can get those documents submitted and uploaded appropriately to your record.
Our follow-up question from Adelina. Can you have a pickup window at a storefront?
The local rules and regulations do not allow for direct sales through exterior openings such as a drive-through window or a walk-up window.
Ariella J asks, are there still grant funds available for SEA waivers during the 2024 renewal process?
As it relates to the renewal fees, there are not deferrals or waivers available for the 2024 renewal process. At this time, DCR only has fee waivers available to phase 3 retail round 2 applicants, and monies were directly appropriated against their lottery record which would cover one pre-application review fee, the equity share review, as well as the application review. But separate from those waivers, we do not currently have any waivers for social equity individual applicants or social equity applicants.
Thank you, Jason. Our next question comes from Kevin B. I think I qualify as an SEIA. How can I get a license?
If you haven't already been verified as a social equity individual applicant, you're not going to be able to submit an application as a social equity applicant. You would have to first wait for the social equity individual applicant verification process to reopen, and then submit your supporting documentation to get verified. At this time, we're not currently reviewing requests for verification.
Thank you, Jason. Stephen L. is asking, documents were uploaded as instructed, but no invoice was generated automatically. My understanding is that it's happening to a number of applicants. What is the remedy?
So that is intentional. DCR has the 15 days to generate the invoices. So we have been watching to see how the fees are being assessed, because the fee structure is a little bit differently than what was previously done. So previously, the default renewal is $4,233 per activity. So one of the things Michelle as director has been trying to do is reduce the financial burden on applicants and licensees. So what we've done is we've reduced the number of documents that we're requiring to be submitted as part of the renewal process, which is the basic document review fees that are set at $646 per activity. And then separately, for businesses that are renewing their local compliance underway, they're not assessed the fee for the standard inspection. Only records with temporary approval are being assessed the standard inspection fee as part of their renewal process. So folks that are submitting the records are helping us verify how the fees are being applied to the records, and any modifications that have to happen to the fees applied to the record will be dealt with before we start to issue the invoices, which will either happen later this week, but no later than the end of next week. And then once we verify that the fees are being assessed as anticipated, we will be turning back on the automatic invoice generation. So stay tuned.
Thank you, Jason. So this next question is a bit similar, but different. It's from George W. When I applied for our license and submitted and uploaded all required documents, we received a message, which was this record was locked by requirement on 9/13/2023. In the past, micro businesses, we paid 3 licensed activity. This year, the fee was only 1/3 of the past. We can't even print an invoice. Could you please address these issues?
So I will try to remember to hit all the points. So
let me know if you need me to repeat any of that.
Okay, just keep track of the question and what I respond to, and if I hit it all. And if I miss anything, just let me know. So there are 4 documents that are required as part of this renewal process. We're asking for evidence of current site control. We're asking for the current business premises diagram. We're asking for a current indemnification agreement, and we're asking for the project-specific information form, which is the 4013 form for the environmental review. When you submit your renewal record, those document requirements are locked on the record. So that notifies the analyst that documentation has been submitted for them to review, and we'll review the fees that are assessed on the record. We'll be responsible for generating an invoice. And then once we verify that the documents you've uploaded meet the requirements, we'll go ahead and unlock the record. If there's documentation that you omitted or you submitted the wrong documents, the wrong document type, you're going to have to work directly with your assigned analyst for them to unlock the record so that you can make any of those corrections prior to them beginning to process your renewal record. If they get into processing the renewal record and they find deficiencies in the document, you may be subject to additional fees associated with additional document review. As I mentioned in the last question, the fees, the director has intentionally tried to reduce the fees that local applicants and licensees are paying to continue to comply with local requirements. And one of the things that she's done is she's reduced the number of documents that have to be submitted as part of the renewal process, which of course reduces the fee because there's less documents for us to review. And then secondly, based on the code, we have folks that have local compliance underway that are not operating. They're not subject to the annual compliance inspections. They don't have to pay the inspection fee. And then for the folks that do have temporary approval, they are subject to the inspection fees. So we will get around to reviewing the fees on your record prior to generating the invoice. And then once the invoice gets generated, you'll be able to print it. So if you were underassessed, overassessed, we will make those adjustments before we issue the invoice.
I think you got all the questions answered. Thank you, Jason. Our next question comes from Eric H. Will you be accepting additional SEIA eligibility verification applications in the future?
That is the plan, but we do not have a tentative date for when that process will reopen.
Okay, moving on from Sam M. When are you guys having another mixer to get everyone together if you need assistance or help or investor?
I believe the social equity team is currently planning for the next set of social equity events, but I believe we're done with events for calendar year 2023. If you have specific questions, I would recommend emailing the SEP team directly to see whether or not they have any future events planned for this year, which I believe they do not. And then also the SEP team is great with working with our admin team to get information posted to the DCR website, as well as working with our communications team to make sure that email blast and social media postings are being made. So if you're not seeing stuff on the website or through the emails, it hasn't actually been solidified and a date selected yet.
Okay, I'm going to ask this next question verbatim and let you decipher, Jason. It comes from Ivan L. What is the total cost, including taxes, to get a small license?
Local application fees are approximately $10,000 if you're applying for one activity, and it's slightly less than $10,000 if you're applying, well, $10,000 per activity if you're applying for multiple activities. There's certain fees that are site specific, like the pre-application review fee. And then there's other things that are site specific, like the inspections, and then you pay application fees for each of the activities. Until you get a license, you would not be operating and have a responsibility to pay local business taxes. There aren't sales tax or other generic taxes applied to application fees. And then of course, the state has their own fee structure for their application process. We do have our fees posted on the website. It's under Municipal Code Section 10419, which can give you an idea of what the individual costs for different activities and different services would be. And of course, those costs are going to vary, whether it's a general application, the social equity application, and the types of activities that you're applying for.
Let's see, we have a question from several individuals, Levon E, Nick S, and Amity. Will there be another retail lottery round? If yes, approximately when?
We still have capacity to issue retail licenses, so there will be another lottery conducted. At this time, I do not have a tentative date, so we'll share that information as soon as it becomes available.
Our next question from Nick S. Can I have a retail license and a lab license since everything has to be tested to be sold anyway?
At the local level, there's not a prohibition on an owner of a retail license also being an owner of a testing laboratory license. They are separate applications that would require you to submit 2 different applications and then get vetted for compliance with both of the requirements at the local level. If you think that there could be something at the state level that would prohibit you from doing that, I would recommend reaching out to the Department of Cannabis Control.
Our next question from JJ, last initial V. Are pictures of an abandoned building or a copy of active for sale listing enough evidence to show a school and or child care center is no longer in business and therefore should not be considered a sensitive use trigger? What evidence is needed?
So the answer to the first part of the question is no. Effectively, what we as a department do based on the municipal code is on a quarterly basis, we go to the identified websites for the different agencies that maintain that information. And then we download their list of licensees or active records and then review it for whether or not it meets the local requirements to be considered a sensitive use. So if you had a child care center that is still listed as being licensed with a valid license on the state's website, it will be considered a sensitive use for that quarter. And it will only be removed as a sensitive use when the state updates their records to no longer have that license associated with either that location or they show that the license has been expired or surrendered. So if you believe that there is a school or a childcare center that is not operating, I would recommend you reach out directly to the agency that maintains that licensing data and you provide the evidence to them, because until they remove it from their list, it will continue to be considered a sensitive use based on our code.
Our next question comes from 2 individuals, Brandon M and John J. Why are retail and delivery licenses only available to social equity individuals, and why do those with a cannabis conviction get the opportunity for retail?
That's a very loaded question. So, I mean, going back to 2018, the city council made a policy decision to give social equity individual applicants an opportunity to apply for commercial cannabis licenses. And they had constructed a 2-to-1 processing ratio for certain activities and a 1-to-1 processing ratio for other activities. The city council also gave priority processing through Proposition M to businesses that could demonstrate they met the definition of an existing medical marijuana dispensary, which of course were not social equity applicants. So in order to help the city achieve the policy goal of processing social equity applicants, either on a 2-to-1 processing ratio or a 1-to-1 processing ratio, they made policy decisions to limit who could apply for certain license types for a limited period of time to give the department the opportunity to meet that policy goal. And then once the policy goal had been met, the application process would open up to everybody once again.
Our next question comes from Deidre H. What resources are available for those who want to apply for a delivery license?
So if you're a verified social equity individual applicant, you would have access to the department's learning management system, or LMS. So there's over 160 hours of educational content available through the LMS. Separately, you may be eligible to get a referral for pro bono or low bono legal services through DCR's partnership with the Los Angeles County Bar Association. There's also a number of webinars and recordings that are available on DCR's website. The social equity team does work with various vendors through our business licensing and compliance assistance program to provide one-on-one coaching. They're working on the notices to proceed for the next phase of coaching. And then from time to time, we get state grant monies, and then those funds can be used in support of social equity applicants based on whatever the categories the state has adopted for that funding year to provide services. So I know the social equity program is looking for the grant opportunities and what services could be provided through those grant opportunities. And then they'll have more to announce at a later date if we are awarded any of those grants.
Our next question comes from Rabin W, who asks a question that's very similar to an earlier one, but different. How does DCR determine if there's a predatory practice in its paperwork, and how is it handled?
So, I mean, again, what somebody considers to be predatory is very subjective. What we do is we look at the municipal code and whether or not the operating agreement and the business formation documents comply with the code. I assume that this question is in reference to social equity applicants, which in addition to all of the requirements that general applicants have to meet, they also have to comply with Municipal Code Section 10420, which identifies ownership percentages, what types of language must be included in the operating agreement, et cetera. So when we do the equity share review, we're looking at those documents on their face to see whether or not there's anything that explicitly does not comply with 10420. And again, we don't provide business or legal advice. So if you have questions about whether or not your documents comply with the municipal code and the requirements, I would recommend you seek professional legal advice.
Thank you, Jason, for that. Our next question also comes from Rabin. What do analysts review in paperwork before giving licenses for dispensaries?
I mean, the analysts review the documentation that's required as part of our application process. So the different forms, documents, information that are required to have a complete application. And then, you know, for records that are subject to equity share review, they would also be looking at the operating agreement to make sure that required language is included. And then none of the terms on their face would currently be a violation of 10420. There is an ongoing requirement to make sure that you continue to comply with the requirements of the code. So as part of the renewal process, there's different documents that have to be submitted or attestations that get submitted to ensure continued compliance.
We have three individuals with the following question: Flora G, Helen R, Linda D. What is the deadline to apply for a license for those selected in the Phase 3 Retail Round 2 lottery? And can we apply for an extension?
Pursuant to the Los Angeles Municipal Code, Phase 3 Retail Round 2 lottery participants that were selected to submit an application have 1 year from the date of the lottery to submit their pre-application record. So the pre-application record needs to be filed with DCR by December 8th. You don't have to have had your record deemed eligible for further processing by that date, but we do have to have a record before us in order for you to comply with that deadline. The code has an express provision that says, you know, folks selected through the lottery have 1 year to submit a pre-application record, and DCR does not have the authority to accept extensions or provide extensions of time. That would require a modification to the municipal code. And that would, of course, be subject to city council and mayor approval. And currently, there's not a motion or anything pending before them that would grant an extension of time.
Our next question comes from Dana C. If we received a notice of exemption from DCR, do we still need to submit Form 4013?
Yes. So the notices of exemption that were generated were the draft notices based on our review of the project to allow for applicants to renew their state provisional licenses, because the state has new requirements to renew provisional licenses after July 1st of 2023. So we provided the drafts for folks to comply. Separately, we're working on the final report that'll either go to the director or to the Cannabis Regulation Commission. And the updated Form 4013 has a series of questions for the different categorical exemption classes that may apply to your specific project. So the supplemental questionnaire will need to be completed so that your analyst has the ability to review the responses and then fold it into the report that will go to that decision maker.
This question is also from Dana. What are the requirements and benefits to a Tier 3 license? How can I submit proof of satisfying requirements, and what happens after submission of proof?
So Tier 3 applicants got the benefit of participating in Phase 2 under LAMC Section 10408. And Tier 3 applicants are not bona fide social equity applicants themselves. What they were agreeing to is to entering into a social equity agreement to provide benefits to a bona fide social equity applicant. As part of the annual license application process, Tier 3 applicants will be required to submit their social equity agreement for review by the department. And if the department agrees that the social equity agreement complies with the requirements, then that's one piece towards getting to a notice of complete application. You may have already satisfied those requirements, and based on the social equity agreement that you submit and the attestations by the social equity applicant that would also have to be licensed by the city to meet these requirements, we may be able to verify that you've already met the requirements. Other folks will have an ongoing obligation to meet those requirements, and they'll have to, as part of the renewal process, provide evidence that they are compliant with those agreements. So stay tuned for the communication on the next steps for folks that need to complete the annual license application process.
We had a couple of individuals ask this similar question from Christina L. and Ivan D. How was the window of time for PCN requests determined?
So the filing period was based on opening a window and then keeping all of the PCN requests on the same processing timeline. So a 2-week filing window gives DCR enough time to invoice prospective PCN applicants for applicable fees. And then once the fees are paid, process the different land use documents. And then for the land use documents that are confirmed to be eligible for further processing, notify the applicants that they're eligible to submit their formal PCN request to the city council, invoice them for applicable fees, and then collect the documents and be in a position to submit all of the requests citywide to the city council within the same week, so that by the time the city council begins to review these PCN requests to see whether or not a finding could be made, they have all of the information for that PCN processing period. On a go-forward basis, the department anticipates opening up the PCN process once or twice a year, because it does take about 6 months to complete. And one of the comments that we got from the pilot program was there was frustration around requests coming in and the council members not being able to see all of the prospective requests at the same time that were under consideration. And then of course, the PCN request any of the PCN requesters have not actually submitted an application. So nobody has actually planted their flag or created a buffer. So for other PCN applicants, it's nice to know where they would stand prior to locking down a lease and preparing application materials in the hopes that they're going to be, the finding is going to be made and they're going to be eligible to submit an application to the department.
Thank you for that. Lynn H asks, if a community doesn't want a dispensary in their neighborhood, what power do they have to prevent their annual licensing?
Not wanting a dispensary in the neighborhood is not one of the listed denial reasons in the Los Angeles Municipal Code. So if members of the public were wondering why an application may be denied, I would recommend going through the Municipal Code section 104 to identify the reasons for denial that DCR has before it.
Okay, thank you. Rachel W asks, for the PCN window that closed on 8/29, can you add a DBA or edit the LLC name on the PCN application once you submit it?
So you can't edit the legal entity name separate and apart from an amendment to the legal business entity record. The LLC would be assigned an FEIN number, a Secretary of State entity number, and then the BTRC, which is the local tax registration number, would also be assigned to that legal entity. So if you're editing the legal name of the entity, you're going to have to start with the California Secretary of State. And if they do not consider it a name change, they consider it a different entity, you will not be able to move forward with that PCN application as that entity, because that would then get you a different BTRC number and it's not the same applicant or licensee. You would have to wait for the next PCN filing period. If you want to add a doing business as, also known as a fictitious business name, you would just submit that modification request against the legal business entity record. And then if you are selected, well, if council makes the public convenience or necessity finding and has it adopted, then you'd have the ability to submit the application. And because the information was already on your legal business entity record, it would carry over to your application.
Thank you, Jason. George W. asks, how do we get in contact with our analyst?
If you know your analyst, you can email dcrlicensing@lacity.org and then put attention to your analyst. If you don't know who your analyst is, you'll still email dcrlicensing@lacity.org. And then our team going through the emails will identify the record and identify the analyst, and then ask the analyst to come in and respond to your inquiry. It is important when you're emailing us to make sure that you're including your local record number so that our team can quickly identify who the assigned analyst is, and then notify them that there's something pending their review in this shared email box.
Our next question comes from Taylor B. How would you recommend we best get attention on illicit dispensaries for enforcement?
So as folks have probably heard me say time and time again, the Department of Cannabis Regulation doesn't have authority to take any enforcement action against unlicensed businesses. The city does have a complaint portal. DCR does have a compliance and enforcement team with their own dedicated email address. So if you believe there is somebody engaged in a licensed commercial activity, and you email them, if it's not somebody that has a record pending in our licensing portal, it would get routed to LAPD. Ultimately, if information comes to us, the best we can do is forward it to the agencies that do have the enforcement powers over unlicensed businesses. We do our best to support those agencies for the sake of public health, safety, and to support our legal, licensed, and safe cannabis businesses. But we provide information to them as to whether or not there's an applicant or licensee associated with the complaint. And if there's not, then it's up to them as part of either LAPD, Building and Safety, Water and Power, the City Attorney's Office, the Fire Department, to identify what the complaint is, what the appropriate response to the complaint is, and whether or not an enforcement action would be taken against the business that is being complained about.
Our next question also comes from Taylor B, and he asks, how do we best get attention about licensed dispensaries that are breaking the rules?
Again, the complaint portal or emailing the compliance team is the best way to get the department's attention as to the possibility of a violation or unlicensed activity. If the complaint is associated with a business under the purview of the Department of Cannabis Regulation, that will be handled and investigated by the Compliance and Enforcement Division. If it's an unlicensed business or a business that doesn't have any type of record within the DCR licensing portal, we would forward the information to other agencies for their review and possible enforcement action.
Thank you, Jason. The next question from Linda D. How long does DCR have to complete a pre-application review once the fees have been paid?
The basic turnaround time is 30 days. If we need additional information from the applicant, generally we provide the applicant 30 days to provide the information. And then we have 30 days from the date that the information is submitted to us to review it and then complete our analysis. But generally, the PCN records are completed within 30 days. But depending on the circumstance and whether or not it's within a proximity of a potential sensitive use and we need additional information, it could take up to 90 days.
Sorry about that. I was on mute. How long does DCR, I'm sorry, let me skip. Cynthia M asks, how long is the complete process for licensing?
It's going to vary application to application. And it's going to mainly depend on the readiness of the applicant. So what Director Garakian has done with the process is broken it up into smaller bite-sized pieces to allow for prospective applicants to complete different elements of the application without actually having to have site control or submit a formal application to the department. So one of the things that she and our former director, Kat Packer, did was they created this pre-application record so that in lieu of paying the full application fee, prospective applicants could get a land use decision on their proposed business premises location for $597. Now, you don't have to have site control to go through that process. You just have to submit an attestation signed by the landlord that the location is not ineligible for licensure if the application was approved. From the point, if your pre-application record is deemed eligible for processing, you have up to a year to submit your application. So that gives you time to negotiate with the landlord, execute a lease, make material business decisions. Separately, the director has created the legal business entity record, and she did that for two reasons. One is to make the process more streamlined, two, to reduce the fees so that applicants get basically credit for the business entity and the documents that are reviewed across application records if they have multiple application records before the department. The other benefit is for social equity applicants, once they've submitted their legal business entity record, they can request the equity share review, which is tied to the operating agreement, the documents associated with the business entity, and then the review of the ownership documents for compliance with 10420. That can be done separate and apart from having site control and submitting an application. So folks that have an entity, have an ownership group, have the ability to make that request can do so without actually having site control and executed lease. So the other piece is the actual application, which is now boiled down to things that are tied to the proposed business premises diagram, time, place, manner, evidence of site control, indemnification agreement, proposed business premises diagram, various attestations tied to the location. And then one of the most important documents is going to be the 4013, which is your proposed project description that we need in order to prepare an environmental report for your project. So the process is basically broken into three broad categories. You've got the legal, once you get through the pre-app process and the location is deemed eligible for further processing, you have the legal business entity component, which is assigned to one of our licensing teams and may or may not include the equity share review depending on the applicant. You have the environmental analysis that is handled by the team that also does the pre-application review. They're checking the zoning, they're checking the distancing, and they're most familiar with the records and what's happening in and around that proposed location. And then our third team is the folks that are actually processing the site-specific information tied to the application. So now records aren't going to one analyst for complete soup to nuts processing. It's going into 3 different teams, and those teams each have subject matter experts on each of the forms and documents required for that process. And then ultimately, once the applicant has completed all 3 of the processes, the application comes together, and then you may be eligible for a notice of complete application. So we've kind of designed the annual licensing process to be completed in as little as 3 to 6 months. From the time the application gets submitted to the time it can be deemed complete. And then we can complete the staff report to either route it to the director or to the Cannabis Regulation Commission. For the retail storefront applications, those do require community meetings. They also require a public hearing. And there's mandated timeframes to 1, notice those meetings, and then 2, conduct the meeting to collect information to finalize the staff report that would then ultimately go to the Cannabis Regulation Commission.
Thank you, Jason. I wanted to check in with you. We've got about 3 minutes of time, and I'm counting about 7 questions to go. So we may not finish unless you can stay a little longer.
I will try to keep my responses brief, and I can probably stick around till 1:10 before I get in trouble and I'm late for my next meeting.
Understood. Okay. The next question comes from Hovik V. I understand we need CEQA for the state to approve my license. Is this correct? If not, what is required for me to completely finish my state license?
So the state is no longer issuing provisional licenses. So the only license the state is issuing at this point are annual licenses. In order to have a complete state annual license application, you must have been issued a local annual license, and your environmental document must be deemed final. So for a lot of the projects that have been submitted to the department, we are preparing categorical exemption determinations that will be included with the staff report that will then be sent to the director or the Cannabis Regulation Commission. Those environmental reports cannot be approved separate and apart from the discretionary action, which is the issuance of the commercial cannabis license for your business. Therefore, the environmental report can't even get approved until DCR has made a recommendation to issue the annual license. Once the decision maker has approved DCR's recommendation to issue the annual license, then we could, for instance, file the categorical exemption determination with the county to reduce the appeal period for under CEQA from 180 days down to 35 days. And then once the appeal period has passed or the appeal has been filed and it's been adjudicated by the city council, then and only then is it deemed final for the state's purposes, as well as for the city's purposes to issue the actual annual license. So you do need to get an adopted environmental report to comply with the state's annual licensing requirements. You can't do that until you have received your local annual license and the appeal period allowed under CEQA has passed.
Okay, our next question comes from Maital M. With regards to renewals, in the past, there have been a significant delay on processing renewal payments. Is DCR planning to coordinate with the Office of Finance this year to prevent delays?
We coordinate with the Office of Finance every year. The Office of Finance they are the tax collection agency for the entire city. They do have a number of departments that they service and process payments for. So we do our best to provide them with up-to-date information of what invoices may be coming their way so that we can reconcile. And, hopefully The additional staff they've received and gotten trained will help reduce any processing delays you may have experienced in years past.
Our next question from Dean P. Why do you change forms each year with no material changes on the state level?
Our local forms are based on our local process and local law. So, every year there are material changes made to the municipal code. And for instance, earlier this year, the mayor and council actually adopted our formal annual application process, and they updated definitions. And then that necessitates changes to the forms to reflect those changes. So our forms and changes to our forms are based on our local process and changes to our local program, not necessarily the state. And that explains why, even if the state doesn't change something, you may see changes at the local level.
Mark R asks, how long will the PCN process take overall from today?
We anticipate that we will be transmitting formal PCN requests to the city clerk's office in mid-November. And council has 90 days to make a finding, or the PCN request is denied by operation of law. So I anticipate that by the end of February, this current iteration of the PCN process will be completed.
MS is asking, out of the 4 required renewal forms, all but the 4013 form have already been submitted as part of the TA app and fees paid. Why does DCR need to review a lease, premise diagram, and indemnification form if those already have been submitted and paid?
So the code requires every record with the status of local compliance underway or temporary approval to renew the record annually. The lease is evidence of site control. The premises diagrams, there are a number of businesses that are working with building and safety, fire, public health, and other agencies to meet their permitting requirements. And those agencies may require updates to the business's premises diagram, which then have to be reported to DCR. So in lieu of charging people thousands of dollars in fees, we're allowing them to submit those changes to us as part of this renewal cycle. And we're just doing a simple document review as opposed to doing a document review plus inspection. The indemnification form needs to be updated and submitted as part of this renewal process. We didn't collect any documents as part of the 2023 renewal process because we knew we were going to be transitioning applicants to the annual application process. And then, of course, we've already drafted the categorical exemption determination documents for many of our businesses that had previously submitted the 4013 form. And that was done to help folks be able to renew their state provisional licenses. And now staff have to put together the final staff report, which includes additional questions and supplemental information that we need to collect so that we can get these applications deemed complete and then start the process of getting the staff reports prepared and transmitted to the decision maker to make a determination of whether or not an annual license will be submitted. So we were intentional about not charging people the $4,233 per activity. The director significantly decreased the cost of all renewals across the board, especially for folks that have multiple activities and multiple locations. And the per activity fee was reduced to $646 per activity. And then for the businesses with temporary approval, they'll pay either 1 standard inspection fee or 2 standard inspection fees if they have retail storefront and non-retail activities.
Okay, we have 2 more questions. If I'm applying for a PCN license and have received the invoice and also paid the received the invoice and paid the invoice, but my status on Excel is still showing as not paid. When does the land use verification process start?
The 30-day period for DCR to complete the pre-application review starts when your fees are paid. It is our plan to complete all of the land use reviews for PCN records and then notify folks that are eligible for further processing the same week so that we can invoice them for the PCN fees that are applicable to moving forward in the process, and then also collecting the applicable PCN forms that will have to be submitted to City Council so that everybody stays on the same processing track, so that by the next generation of fee payments and document collection, we'll be in a position to submit everything to the city clerk the week of November 13th, so that while council's on recess that week, they can prepare all of the council files and get all of the information submitted, so that then council has a complete picture of all of the pending PCN requests for this iteration of the process.
Okay, Jason, last question from Tiana W. Does the social equity round 2 phase 3 pre-application need to be renewed if they filed earlier this year?
If your DCR record ends in pre-app, those records do not need to be renewed. Just remember that you have up to 1 year from the date that the pre-application was deemed eligible for further processing to submit your application. For everybody we've transitioned into the annual licensing process, those businesses had received at a minimum a status of local compliance underway. So those records do have to be renewed. So if your record ends in -ANN, it needs to be renewed for 2024. If you do not have temporary approval, you'll have to pay the $646 fee per activity and then upload the documents. If you do have temporary approval, you'll pay the $646 fee per activity, and you'll pay a standard inspection fee if you have just retail or you have just non-retail, or you'll pay for 2 inspection fees if you have retail as well as non-retail. And again, all of the renewal fees are significantly less than they were under the basic renewal fee of $4,233 per activity.
And with that was the last question. Thank you.
Thank you, Gidget. And I do just want to let folks know that may have questions about the 2024 license renewal process. I will be hosting a webinar on Wednesday, September 20th at noon. All licensees and application records that have that ANN suffix are going to have to be renewed. We will be going through the process and then answering questions about that process. So if you do have clients or you're an applicant or licensee that has to renew your 2024 record, please tune in next Wednesday at noon. And then we will be helping answer questions and provide more information about that process. So with that, I want to thank everybody for coming, and I look forward to talking to folks and answering more questions at our next Q&A virtual lunch on October 11th at noon.